to talk about coalitions. The topic for the panel today is Jews Cannot End Anti-Semitism by Themselves, Working with Coalitions to Confront Hate. And I think before we dive right in, just a little bit of context is important. So over the past few years, we all have seen an incredibly disturbing rise in hatred, bigotry, and white supremacist violence that has deeply concerned us at ADL. We've seen neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville. We've seen immigrants told to go back to where they came from. We've seen Muslim women in Congress vilified and subjected to death threats. We saw the largest mass shooting in US history at Pulse nightclub, the deadliest attack against the Jewish community in the US at Tree of Life. And we've also seen an extremely disturbing rise in violent hate crimes against people of color. This rise in anti-Semitism, alongside anti-Black racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-LGBTQ animus, is no coincidence. These systems of oppression are all interconnected and self-reinforcing, which essentially means that we cannot destroy any of them until we destroy all of them. Unfortunately, though, there are still those voices, particularly in today's climate, that try to convince us that our interests are actually at odds with one another, that somehow our identities are in competition. That, of course, is not true, and it only serves to slow down our progress. So from ADL's perspective, this panel could not be more important. It could not be coming at a better time. And I'm hoping that in the short time that we have here together, and with the help of this very esteemed panel, we can begin to tackle the following questions. First, how do we unite to confront all forms of hate, and why is it essential that we do so? Second, how do we form and preserve powerful social justice coalitions in the face of hate? Third, what are the forces that are really seeking to distract and divide us from our work, and how do we overcome them? And finally, what happens when we give in to the temptation to circle the wagon, so to speak, and to step back from our collective engagement with other communities? And so with that, I'd like to dive right in. I think everyone on this stage would agree that in order to combat hate and all forms of bigotry, we need deep, trusting, and lasting relationships. And before we dive into coalition work, I just want to explore a bit the premise underlying the first part of our panel, which is Jews cannot end anti-Semitism by themselves. And I'd like to pose this question to all of the panelists. What experience do you have to indicate that it is important to work together to combat hatred and discrimination of all kinds? And what can happen when we try to fight systems of oppression in isolation?
As Amy mentioned, I was the immediate past president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is the nation's premier civil and human rights coalition. All of the organizations that you've heard mentioned today are members of the Leadership Conference. ADL, Unidos US, and the Muslim Advocates are all members of the Leadership Conference. And we stand for the premise that in coalition there is strength. And no one organization has sufficient strength unto itself to make the necessary changes in society that we'd like to see happen. Now let's examine the premise. If Jews could address anti-Semitism by themselves, would we have anti-Semitism today? The answer is of course not. Of course not. Obviously, the Jewish community has long wrestled with the challenges of how to be true to their faith, while at the same time not running afoul of civil law in countries all over the world. And yet there is a history of persecution because of your religious beliefs that makes this an especially challenging and difficult time. Now, we operate under the premise that all of us are exposed to certain challenges, particularly regarding the rise in hatred. It's not just a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. So whether we're talking about Viktor Orban in Hungary, or the former premier of Austria, Kraus, or whether we're talking about what's happening in Germany, the cycles of anti-Semitic hatred that bubble up from time to time, this is an issue that will not address itself, and it requires a collective effort of people of goodwill to try to be engaged. And I'll literally cut to the chase. What we have seen from the inception of civil rights organizations in the US, that if there were no coalitions, there would be no progress. Think about the founding of the NAACP in 1909. The NAACP was founded by a coalition of African American and Jewish activists who came together recognizing that they had a shared interest in addressing the hostility mostly directed at African Americans, but obviously at Jews as well. When you think about the lynching of Leo Frank in 1950, it lets you know that this was a phenomenon that predated the current era. And obviously, I don't need to speak to the horrors of World War II. What we're dealing with today, however, is the same, the resurgence of the same canards, the same stereotypes that we have seen in times past. And they often surface during economic difficulty or when you have an authoritarian voice in power that chooses to demonize a particular community as a way of course, disguising other problems. I don't want to go on too long, Amy,
Sure.
but I do want it to be said, look, in order to address this, guys, obviously laws have been passed. We see how hate crime statutes are being enforced. But there are too many incidents to allow an effective one-by-one strategy of enforcement every time an incident occurs. We need a global affirmative response, and that starts with a public education campaign that speaks to the heart of where we are in this country. If you strip away some of the politics that currently clouds our circumstances today, the American people, by and large, have good hearts. They believe in the values of the country. That's what makes us unique as a place of diversity around a certain core set of values. And if we appeal to that over a sustained period, I think we can be effective. So I'd like to talk more about what we can do going forward, but I think the importance of this panel can't be overstated, and I commend Jonathan Greenblatt, a dear friend, who works very hard to advance the interests of this organization and the community, for pulling together a program like this and inviting me. Thanks, Amy.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wade, I think, put it very straightforward. The more folks that you have with you, the stronger you are. And the reality is that what we're up against requires all of the strength that we can muster. And also, I think that sometimes we forget that it's a constant. Just because you defeat the forces of hate once, it doesn't mean that they're forever gone. And so the work to continue to strengthen civil society, both to make sure that we have an informed civil society and that is a civil society that is ready and able to be stewards of that democracy, of that society where that kind of hate and otherizing is not tolerated, is a forever task. And because it is a forever task, that means not only working in coalition at the moment or in the minute, but also working to ensure that that torch is continuously passed on and shared, because the work needs to continue. Particularly for me as a first generation, as an immigrant to this country, it's always been really special. I remember the first time I went through Ellis Island and seeing what Wade was talking about, that the kind of rhetoric that you're hearing today has been going around and around. It ain't original. It ain't original. And it was used against every group of Americans that came to this country. And I think that sometimes when you may be seduced into thinking that it is about you meaning whatever the group of the moment against whom the attacks are being unleashed, and that you need to go at it alone, or that other groups cannot identify with that. And so one of the things that we have seen, and one of the collaboration going back more than 10 years now with ADL and with Wade, actually, was on an anti-hate effort that really sought to connect the dots, and particularly for a lot of our fellow Americans that romanticize the past and maybe don't remember how their grandparents or their great-grandparents were ostracized and even persecuted or vilified at some point. the importance of memory, the importance of the history, and the importance of being aware of that so that you prevent it. And so coalitions, building on what Wade said about needing to act together in the moment to respond to something, is also about that history. To be that documentarian and that platform that allows for other folks to be steeped into those actions and the need to continue them. We have certainly experienced that in the Latino community. Like I said, the declaration I referenced was more than 10 years ago. And sadly, again, this year with the tragedy in El Paso, of the importance of standing together with others, because at the end we recognize that the hate that fuels any one of those actions is actually the same hate that finds different forms of expression and that lashes out against a different community at a different time, but it shares a common origin.
Great.
I agree with both of what was said before. And the only thing I would add is really to just underscore the last point. That's not just that it's the same form of hate, but I think when you peel back the layers, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or anti-Black racism or homophobia, it's often the same tools being utilized to advance those ends. I remember when I worked previously at Muslim Advocates, we had spent a lot of time combating a policy here in New York City that at the time was perpetuated by the NYPD after September 11th, where they infiltrated mosques and Muslim student groups and engaged in a whole host of discriminatory conduct. And as I was working with our team to resolve that litigation, our co-counsel, I thought back to the same time that was happening in the kind of the 2000s. At the very same time, in the same place in New York City, the NYPD was also engaging in stop and frisk, which essentially was the same conduct against the African American and Latino community, right? A different name, but the same exact tool and the same exact design to kind of further hate and bigotry and discrimination. And the problem of lacking coalitions is not just that we lose the benefit of the history and the context, but we also lose the benefit of hearing directly from other communities that are dealing with the precisely same issues and how we might tackle them more effectively. And so there's a real strategic benefit to coalition building as well, that when we actually come together, we not only learn that the hatred is remarkably similar, but we also learn that the tools of hatred are remarkably similar, and we can begin to deconstruct those as well.
Thank you. So I think that is just a really important reminder up front why it is so important to work in coalition. From ADL's perspective, we have joined many battles with other organizations in coalition where it was pretty clear that working in isolation would not have accomplished the goal. I can think of one very recent example in Massachusetts, actually, where there was a ballot initiative that sought to repeal protections, non-discrimination protections based on gender identity in places of public accommodation. And in order to defeat that measure, we had to get the law enforcement perspective to the table. We had to get a faith-based perspective to the table. We had to pull together all of our civil rights allies and allied organizations to the LGBTQ community in order to really build the momentum and speak to the humanity of the issue in order to combat that ballot initiative. So, I think that the strength in numbers cannot be understated. We need to be able to build powerful social justice coalitions that are too big to be ignored. And I think that is part of the goal that we have today, working together in coalition to confront the rising tide of hate that we are seeing across the board. I do want to also just, remind folks about the importance of thinking about not only issues but also identities and how many of the issues that we are fighting on actually impact individuals in varied ways. So, just by way of example, I am a gay Jewish woman, and so LGBTQ issues are Jewish community issues. 10 to 20% of the Jewish community identifies as people of color. Racism is a Jewish community issue. issue. And I think thinking about issues in that way, not only how systems of oppression are overlapping, but how systems of oppression actually impact individuals who share multiple identities is incredibly important as we move forward and work together. So with that, I do want to turn into how we form coalitions in the first place. And I think, Jonathan, you are a great voice when it comes to this topic. During your time at Muslim Advocates, how were you able to build such a diverse and strong and powerful coalition in opposition to the Muslim ban, particularly where there was so much urgency and so little time? And what challenges did you face along the way in doing so?
Sure. So, before I joined Muslim Advocates, I was in the Obama administration in the Department of Justice. And my last day there was January 20th, which was the last day, the first day of this administration, obviously. So my job ended January 20th, and I was planning to take months of time off with my newborn son and my family and catch up on sleep. And then 7 days later, January 27th, is when the president issued the Muslim ban. And literally that following Monday, I had a conversation with Muslim Advocates, and I was actually not planning to work at Muslim Advocates. I'm not Muslim, and so that was not, something that was kind of on my radar screen as a place of employment. But in talking with them and also seeing everything that happened that weekend, I'm sure you all remember the images of the airports of people coming out, of families being separated. It hit me in a really personal and visceral way that, if I say I'm committed to civil rights, then what bigger challenge to civil rights is happening in that moment than literally what was happening to the Muslim community at that time. And so I kind of very quickly jumped on board, and you're right, in that immediate aftermath, there was so much confusion. There were a number of legal challenges being filed. I would say, some of the coalition building was actually probably helped by the president, in the sense that, it was, in essence, the first kind of major act of discrimination that the administration undertook. And I think there was something that just shocked the nation, right? I think that's where you saw all these protests and all these people really rallying together. Just, I think now in some ways we've become desensitized to some of that. But in that moment, in January 2017, it really did shock the national conscience that we would do that. And I think that was particularly important for the Muslim community, because as I began working there and got to know that community better, one thing that became really clear was that, particularly in the post-September 11th world, it was really difficult for the Muslim community to kind of tell their story, right? That there was such a kind of national security terrorism frame that had been and is still being applied to that community. And so many of the efforts to build coalitions, to educate the American people about that community were really stymied because of that overarching frame that existed. And the Muslim ban kind of broke open that window, right? There was an opportunity where the story about the Muslim community wasn't September 11th or Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It was about how could we be doing this to people? And the real opportunity there was to use that moment of time, which I think we all knew would not last forever, to both educate people about who this community actually is, but also to bring people together in coalition around what I continue to believe is a terrible, bigoted, discriminatory policy. And one of the, I think, most powerful and effective ways to do that was really to kind of unite the stories of discrimination that communities were able to relate to in the context of the Muslim ban. So one of the most powerful tools that I think happened over the course of that campaign was we had Japanese American communities come together and tell the story of internment and say, when we see the Muslim ban, what we see is what happened to our relatives, the history of our community, and how this looks eerily similar. We had Jewish communities, ADL and many others, come together and say, this is very similar to the anti-Semitism and the exclusion and the kind of use of government power in a way to mobilize bigotry and discrimination that was really moving and that was able to connect the dots, right? So it didn't become an issue of, is the president not allowing certain people from these 7 or 5 or 8, depending on which version you were using, countries to come into the United States? The conversation became, are we going to be a country that will continue this legacy of using government power to continue bigotry, exclusion, and oppression? And regardless of the outcome, the legal outcome there, obviously the Supreme Court ultimately affirmed the president's use of that policy. One of the, I think, most vivid memories I will have of our efforts there was the day the Supreme Court announced the decision. We had organized with many of our colleagues and partners on the stage and around the country a rally, and literally there were hundreds of people in front of the Supreme Court, people who looked every hue, who prayed to every religion or no religion, every sexual orientation, coming together and saying that this fight is our fight. I think that is, to me, the takeaway, the best takeaway of the Muslim ban. It's not what we did. I'm a lawyer, so I like litigation, I like suing people, I like it more when we win, but what I like even more is that when we actually build lasting coalitions, and that some of that kind of the bigotry and the lack of knowledge and the kind of stereotypes that existed about Muslim communities, I think are forever changed because of the fact that we were able to use the Muslim ban as not just a fight against that one campaign, but against a broader coalition building and education campaign about why we all are united in our efforts to combat hate.
Great. So I want to transition a bit to talk about how we relate to each other in coalition. And Wade, you have been known to say, if you want a friend, you have to be a friend.
That's right.
What does that mean to you when it comes to coalition work, and what examples stand out throughout the course of your career?
Thanks, Amy. First of all, that is the motto of the Leadership Conference. If you want a friend, you have to be a friend. You have to be willing to put yourself in the shoes of your friends and colleagues to appreciate the experiences that they are going through if you expect them to do the same for you. The best example I can cite is the work that the Leadership Conference and ADL did to pass the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Now, we started that campaign in 1996, guys. We wrote a report called Hate Crimes in America, Cause for Concern. It was the first time that a comprehensive assessment of hate crimes affecting every community in the United States was undertaken. It was an inventory. And what we saw was that hate crimes was proliferating, that we were seeing shared problems and experiences, and much of the rhetoric being directed at one community was also directed at another. We sought a White House conference on hate crimes that Bill Clinton helped provide for us. And it served as a launching pad for a legislative effort to strengthen federal law around hate crimes protection and enforcement. We struggled for many years to make it an inclusive bill. There was already an existing statute that gave some modest protection to African Americans, to religious minorities, the Jewish community, and others. It did not include the LGBTQ community. It did not include women. It did not include persons with disabilities. And there was evidence that hate crimes was directed at all of our communities. So we fought for over a decade to pass a bill that was inclusive and that would provide enhanced protection. On numerous occasions, we were offered the chance for a legislative deal. We're happy to give you a bill that will strengthen protections for African Americans or Latinos, but you can't have protections for the LGBTQ community. You can't have protections for women. We're not going to give you protections for persons with disabilities. And our view, and it remained the view of the entire coalition, was that it's all of us or none. We're not accepting half measures. And I'm pleased that Michael Lieberman, your Washington counsel, at ADL, was the co-chair of this task force with me. We fought for over a decade to get that bill enacted into law. It was actually signed into law by President Obama in 2009. So we're talking about a 13-year legislative campaign in which we held out for protections for key groups that would otherwise have been lost under a revised federal statute. You need to recognize that these efforts are not going to be won easily. They're not going to be won overnight. They require struggle and commitment and a willingness to see the value in a collective effort if you were to undertake it jointly. It makes a difference. You know, Amy sort of gave you a little bit of my background, and I appreciate that. But you know, in January of 2015, I addressed the General Assembly right here in the United Nations around the issue of anti-Semitism. Some of you may recall that the General Assembly, for the first time ever, did a broad forum in which anti-Semitism was lifted up as a cause for the General Assembly. Now, I give Samantha Power a lot of credit for that. She engineered and helped move that forward. And when it came time to present the U.S. position, she asked if I would represent the U.S. NGO community in making that presentation. The idea of an African American coming to the General Assembly to talk about anti-Semitism, I'm sure, was not lost on a lot of people there. I got lots of questions. Are you Jewish? And I know it may surprise you. I'm not Jewish, but the truth is, it was very important to be able to say that anti-Semitism is not exclusively a Jewish problem. It's a human rights problem. It affects everyone in the country, and you've got to be able to assert that with belief and vigor to make people understand that the problems you experience as a community are not unique to your community. They are shared problems, and we expect the same for every community that you work with. We expect the same for African Americans or Latinos, for the LGBTQ community, the disability community, and women. And only through that collaborative effort. If you want a friend, you have to be a friend. But that's what it means. And that's how coalition politics is formed, and that's how it's sustained over time.
Thanks, Wade. Those battles that Wade mentioned, particularly when it comes to hate crime statutes and inclusion of LGBTQ protected characteristics, gender identity, sexual orientation, is still going on today. Recently happened in Indiana, where a deal was attempted to be made that would have excluded those categories from a hate crime statute. Once again, the coalition decided we will not take that deal. Indiana, you may be aware of ADL's hate crime map on our website. Indiana is still in orange, which means that we do not consider it as having a hate crime law because it does not include those protected characteristics. So this is an issue that continues on today. I'd like to stick with this topic of allyship and direct the next question to Clarissa. Over the past few years, we have seen an incredibly disturbing surge in anti-immigrant extremism that has shaped the current administration's hardline anti-immigration policies. It's galvanized the anti-immigrant movement. What does true allyship mean from the perspective of Unidos US in this current moment where so much is at stake?
So let me start by also providing a little bit of context, building on what Wade said, that part of the learning experience grappling with extremism and hate is coming to the realization that there's a commonality to it, that anti-Semitism is also what's behind anti-Latino, anti-immigrant, anti-Black sentiment, anti-LGBTQ. And in some ways, for the US Latino community, that has become very apparent through the issue of immigration. I think that in some ways you could say that anti-immigrant sentiment is a gateway drug to full-on hate. For this reason, for a very long time, predating the current administration, immigration has been used to provide a thin veneer of respectability to otherized people in a way that allowed folks who use that to do so the ability to say, oh, it's not that I am anti-Latino or anti-immigrant, it's them illegals that I'm uncomfortable with. But it actually was, again, a thin veneer to allow people to stir anti-Latino sentiment in particular, but really to continue advancing divide and conquer politics, which frankly, when you divide communities, when you divide a citizenry, there's a lot of people who benefit from that. And it is one of the reasons why it's been used for centuries as a strategy to weaken civil society. And so for Latinos, we look at the issue of immigration both from a public policy perspective issue, but also as a civil rights issue. 8 out of 10 Latinos in this country are United States citizens. Yet people have felt in the flesh and experienced in a very real way the fact that it is an excuse to undermine the rights of anybody somebody can argue is perceived to be or seems to be an immigrant. And not only to embolden somebody who might be your neighbor, somebody who runs into your kids at the park, but all the way to the ability for law enforcement or federal law enforcement to stop you and question your belonging in a country where your family may go back to before the birth of the nation. And so the ability for so many communities to get together through the issue of immigration in a way is not, Latinos bear the face overwhelmingly of the current chapter of America's immigration history, but it is a continuous history. And so in some way, it allows for all of our different communities to connect with that part of the American DNA, and to also perhaps, one of the silver linings of what's happening at this moment is because the thin veneer of respectability has been stripped, then we can help people realize what has always lied beneath and then challenge it. I know that right now that feels like we're still a ways away from that, but I would say that that is again an opportunity for us as a nation to reclaim something that is very unique to America, which is our ability to bring people from all over the world together to create one nation, and to continue the pursuit, even if imperfect yet in our reality, of that aspiration of out of many one. And so for us, in many ways, we look both at what's happening in the area of immigration as really a call to action to protect and defend members of our own families, but at the same time as a way to really stand up for that DNA of America that has made this country what it is, and that I think has inspired many in other communities, including people like my husband, whose great-great-grandparents came from Russia a long time ago, to be committed and working on immigration today because of that connection. And the fact that, you know, when we celebrate Passover, we try to do it overlooking Lady Liberty because it's a reminder, and we all need to be constantly reminding ourselves of that.
So, you know, we spoke a little bit about forming powerful coalitions and a bit about the success, but coalitions aren't always easy to keep together. I want to pose this to Wade and Clarissa in particular. Why is it sometimes so difficult for coalitions to retain their momentum? And can you give examples where coalitions have worked well, others where they have not worked so well, and really what were the forces that really dictate how a coalition will either succeed or fail?
I don't think it's rocket science, right? It's like a partnership, like a marriage. I think that rule number one is that to be part of a coalition, one should work with the other folks around the table to have clarity of purpose. I think a lot of times we leave that too vague, and therefore, lacking that, people can have different interpretations about what people are coming together for and what that means. I know it sounds very simplistic, but even within our own organizations, as you know, or in your daily lives, it's important to be grounded in that purpose and be reminded of where exactly are you going. The other thing is to be to be straightforward, to be upfront. In a lot of coalition efforts, there are times where not everybody's going to be able to stand together on something that may be a stretch from the purpose that brought that coalition together. And the worst thing in such a moment is not to be honest about that, and to then allow the sense of duplicity or betrayal because of that. I think being very upfront about what are the limits and or the outer stretches of a coalition effort is important to keep people together and on purpose. And I would say that the other thing is, and this is probably one of the hardest, is to be able to understand how to leverage the different talents, networks, relationships, or strengths that members of a coalition may have. I think that every day we struggle with wanting to, we're all advocates. We want to persuade people to be of our position or our thinking, and often that means that we're trying to, if you're working in coalition, that you want other organizations you are working with to be exactly like you in position and approach. And sometimes the strength of a coalition, frankly, is that you are able to leverage different strengths in different relationships. That is also very complicated and hard to align, which is why working in coalition is very effective, but it's also very hard, and Wade is a master of that. So I would say those are the basics, but as you hear from those, that's the basics almost of how you would handle a number of other situations.
Clarissa, you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, I think one has to recognize that coalitions don't just happen because it's a nice thing to do. That groups decide, oh, let's work together, we're a coalition, let's, share information and try to accomplish a goal. It sounds great, but realistically, it's not going to happen. They are born out of struggle. They are born out of purpose. They are born because you recognize, look, I'm going through some difficult times right now, and I need help. I need people who are going to share my values and will work with me toward a common solution. It can be very tough. Coalitions, of course, often involve groups that don't have equivalent status, equal status with one another. That's very hard. You're going to have to develop a method of decision-making that recognizes the inherent value of your partners, even if they lack the same economic or social status that you may bring to the table. It's a very hard thing to do. There has to be a recognition that you keep uppermost in mind the purpose, and you try to find common denominators that allow you to work together. We make decisions not by voting, because voting is inherently divisive. Obviously you have winners and losers. People who vote, some win, some lose. We prefer consensus, but I can assure you that is very tough, to sit around a table and to hammer out a method of decision making and address issues that show respect for one another. It is very hard. Now I'll give you an example. There is an organization making an effort to come together now, a Jewish-Muslim coalition on an international level. I so commend the people who are engaged in this effort, because it is incredibly important and challenging and positive. And as you can imagine, there are many things going against them in terms of their ability to develop a meaningful relationship that will be sustained over time. But there is a recognition that hate crime activity is getting out of hand. And unless we develop a common strategy to address it, we are going to be engulfed by it. Tree of Life Synagogue, guys, is a watershed moment in American history. We may not like it. You may not want to consider it, but to have the largest number of Jews killed in a mass shooting of some kind, in the 21st century is almost unthinkable. And yet it happened. And if we are going to respond to that, how do you do that? You're not going to be able to set up new enhancements of law. Yes, look, every synagogue is now making an effort to think about security, and You know, I have a friend who's in a very small synagogue that doesn't have the resources to bring a security personnel on board for their services, and they are fearful that their synagogue is ripe for attack because they don't have the wherewithal to bring a law enforcement official. It shouldn't be that way. Shouldn't be that way. So what I'm suggesting to you is, you know, we're going to have to find common denominators, ways of communicating with one another, recognizing that we share deep commitment to values. Another motto for the Leadership Conference is we're working to build an America as good as its ideals. And what that represents from our perspective is America the ideal versus America the real. And we know that the ideal is wonderful, it's perfect. But we're struggling to get there. And we've got to make a commitment to find ways that bring us together, recognize that we have to be generous with one another, loving and sensitive. At the same time, you've got to keep in mind your own interests that brought you to the table, and to be honest about how you share that information, and to expect your friends and colleagues to provide you with some space so that you can be true to yourself, but at the same time be respectful for the coalition relationship that you're trying to form.
Yep. So I think those are great pointers in terms of how we set up coalitions to succeed. We have to come in with very clear expectations, be honest about ourselves and our mission, and also be very clear in what the goal is. ADL has been involved in a number of coalitions where the goal has started off as passing a particular piece of legislation, but evolved from there. And that's where I think things can get complicated in terms of excluding or alienating certain groups, particularly when the goal originally was focused on passing a particular piece of legislation. So I think being mindful of all of those forces and the need for clarity is so, so important. I do want to pivot slightly on this same topic to talk about whether there are any red lines that coalition partners can draw for one another. Are there, or in the alternative, are there any core expectations that coalition partners must have for each other, lines that cannot be crossed? And if so, how do we then continue to hold each other accountable, challenge each other when those difficult scenarios arise? And I'll open this up to any panelists that would like to answer.
Well, I do think it's important, building off of what was said before, just to have clear expectations from the outset. I'm sure anyone who's ever worked in a nonprofit has been in meetings where you're like, why are we in this meeting? And it just goes in a way because there's no clear kind of, there were no rules of engagement for why we're here. And then I think you easily get to places where maybe topics or issues or decision-making processes haven't been cleared or haven't been discussed, and that leads to conflict and often, I think, dissolution of the effort. So I think, having clear expectations on the front end, and then also, I think, clear accountability mechanisms, right? Because I think the reality is that, again, if you're in coalition, that means that you also are doing something else, right? Like your group is not just existing typically, unless you're in the leadership conference, for the purpose of being the coalition. Yeah. Your group is existing to do whatever your mission is. And we all have limited time, resources, money, personnel. And so I think, again, it's not just having a clear mission and kind of rules of engagement, but also having clear expectation of what are people to bring to the table, and if they don't bring that to the table, finding respectful and civil but meaningful ways to hold people accountable for that.
So I think I mentioned it sort of in the positive, but obviously I think one of the important red lines is not being upfront when. Once partners see that an organization has said they would do X, or at least tacitly, and then it doesn't do that, and you've never had a conversation with folks about the limits of how far you might be able to go, restoring that trust is going to be very, very hard. And I think that sometimes the inability to have conversations about those things start undermining coalitions that continue on, because sometimes we also have a hard time ending a coalition if the purpose has changed or if the initial purpose at hand was met. So that then that continues, and it's just a shell of itself, and then you see other similar coalitions pop up, right? But the one thing I would add is that I also think that sometimes there's a tendency to assume that the absence of conflict is the indication of effectiveness. And maybe this is more projection than reflection, hopefully not. But I would say that having the space where people can deliberate and have difficult, debates about ideas and tactics and paths forward is incredibly important. Yes, it's not conflict for the sake of conflict. We need to manage that effectively. But I think more often than not, people assume that it is the absence of that and avoiding it at all means that is what's going to make us effective, and it's actually quite the contrary at times.
Yeah, that's great. I think, that's happened at some points in coalitions where ADL has, or coalitions that ADL has been a part of, where instead of drawing lines in the sand in the sense that, members of this coalition can do nothing to undermine support for this particular legislation, there are sometimes litmus tests, in a sense, that are put in place that would eliminate any organization that does work with law enforcement, for example, from participating in a particular coalition. And as soon as you start to exclude organizations based on other things that they are doing that don't undermine the core value of the coalition, the goal that the coalition set out to accomplish, I think you can run into some very difficult challenges. The best way I have found to overcome those challenges is through relationships. People who really understand what ADL does, what our work is all about, our intentions with respect to our work, and how, that there is a level of trust that as part of a coalition seeking to pass a particular piece of legislation, there is nothing that our organization or any other organization would do to undermine that passage, I think is absolutely key.
Amy, you have used the magic word of the hour, which is relationships. And I think your current leadership understands that, but I have seen numerous examples where coalition work is facilitated by pre-existing relationships. If you really want to move forward in trying to address some of the seemingly most intractable problems that you have, it is good to have relationships. They matter. So when we say if you want a friend, you have to be a friend, it's really about relationships, guys, and how you interact with one another, and a recognition that there are certain red lines. If you haven't articulated them, perhaps you should, but there is also an appreciation for a red line that exists. If I'm in coalition with ADL, it is generally speaking about a domestic issue involving civil and human rights. I'm not going to venture into foreign policy questions because we may disagree. And the truth is, if you are trying to build relationships with organizations that, by coming together, is an oh wow moment, like wow, Jews and Muslims working together around some common core issues, how important is that? Or the Latino and the African American community, which has been seen as competition for one another, actually working closely together around issues of concern. You've got to be able to have those personal relationships if you really want to be effective. So, it doesn't mean that everyone has to go out and get a new friend in a community that you want to work with, right? That's not it. But it is about recognizing that extending yourself and developing relationships with others is a big part of your broadening your own network that strengthens your capacity to be effective in addressing issues of importance to you. This is all about self-interest rightly understood.
Yep.
And it's about coming together to recognize that by extending a hand on the one hand, we can benefit ourselves on the other. And that is that give and take that really helps to make coalitions work successfully.
Great. So we're almost out of time, or we are out of time, but I want to close things with the panelists giving us one statement about what gives you hope in these difficult times. Just one parting thought about what you've seen over the past few years that really has given you hope.
Going down the line, Jonathan.
Yeah. And I hope there's something.
Oh, there is.
No, I mean, I think these are really hard times, and they are challenging times for so many different people. But I do think one of the things that does give me hope is, I think, really, building off of what we've said before, is really seeing how other communities are showing up for their partners and their friends, and maybe people that they didn't know were a part of their community but have now recognized that. And I do think sometimes it does feel like whack-a-mole, where like every day there's another bad thing or bad policy decision, and it can be disorienting. And I think really, I think if you focus on that, it is despairing. But I think if you focus on where there are victories, and the victories don't have to be a legal victory or a policy victory. A victory can be people coming together to express who we really are as a country and what really does unite us in that.
Yeah, I would say one, and this goes back to the beginning, talking about coalitions also as a way to train people that have to continue that vigilance, is having the long view of things. I've heard quite a bit things like, this has never happened before, this is not who we are, and unfortunately, things like this have happened before, and it is
Who we are.
hopefully who we don't want to be, and we get closer to not being that. Not that having been bad gives me hope, but the fact that we overcame those chapters and continuing to learn from them. Doing voter registration, and the education and interaction with the community, because at the end of the day, it is about strengthening civil society, and you continually hear people saying that they never been approached or invited in that process. So that everyday interaction, and frankly, being witness every day to the kindness and resilience of people who approach you to ask you, are we going to see anything good in immigration?
Yes.
Do I have to be afraid for my family or not? But that even in that environment, people can be so kind and so supportive of you, even when they are facing greater odds than you are. That gives me hope, that people continue to be kind in these times, because at the end of the day, what nurtures that resiliency, it's in many ways what also feeds or pushes some to succumb to hate, is the yearning of belonging in a family and community. And if we model that behavior for many others, hopefully they won't be susceptible to fall in the throes of that hate.
No, I think both of those comments are absolutely on point. Look, these are incredibly dark times, right? These are incredibly dark times. We have seen, some of us who are a little older than perhaps others, have seen darker times. We know that they do come, and it's very frightening when you see what appears to be a recurring pattern that suggests that even more dark times are ahead of us. So I'm very concerned about that. But at the same time, I have come to believe that it takes the hottest fire to make the strongest steel. That people respond to challenge by going deep within themselves to find common points of resilience together that help bring about positive change. As fearful as I am for the country right now for many reasons, I would just say on the hate crimes front, I looked at the paper, just glanced at it within the last few weeks. How many of you have heard of Emmett Till? Does that name ring a bell? Okay. A kid, he was 14 years old, murdered in 1955, a celebrated hate crime. He was lynched and he was brutalized, and his mother insisted that his casket be kept open because she wanted the public to see what had happened to her son. I'm reading that the memorial dedicated to Emmett Till had to be replaced and made bulletproof and virtually indestructible because it has been the subject of constant effort at destruction. Same newspaper, I'm looking, there is a young Jewish family in the West that is being subjected to extreme threats by a right-wing, alt-right nationalist who has, for some reason, developed an obsession against Jews. I look at another story, there's a Muslim riding a bus in San Diego, a kid, who gets punched out by some right-wing guy who is angry because he is speaking in a language other than English to a friend sitting next to him. And I'm saying, guys, this is obviously getting out of hand. And then lastly, I'm reading the paper about someone who was convicted and about to be sentenced for threatening to kill Ilhan Omar. And this guy was a credible threat. He called the office, left threats on their voicemail. He was subsequently investigated, found to be in possession of illegally purchased firearms with a preventive order that he should not have access to firearms at all. And they're about to sentence him, he's going to do time. But what that tells me is that every community that we've talked about, whether it's the transgender community with black trans women being killed at a high level, or the Latino community, others, it's a problem. What is ultimately going to bring us together is the recognition that we need to invest quickly in a comprehensive, sustained public education campaign against hate crime activity. ADL has got to be a part of that. The Leadership Conference has got to be a part of that. Unidos US, Muslim advocates, all of us have got to find ways to chip in so that there is a sustained layer of understanding and appealing to our better angels if we're going to respond to this. And I think that kind of challenge is bringing us together, and out of that, I am more optimistic that this period will pass and that the country will be restored to a certain balance that I think is healthy. So thanks for coming. Very much appreciate it.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.